time to continue. Now, our next speaker will talk actually about critical success factor for public services. He has 11 years of experience in European Commission's open source observatory. So, please welcome him. Hi.
Thank you. Thank you. So, good afternoon. I would like to thank the OpenFest organizations for having me here. This is the second time I'm at OpenFest, and I really enjoy being back in Bulgaria. I like Sofia. It's a very interesting city. There's a certain electricity in the air that is very attractive. I think this country is going somewhere. Now, you already read the title. So, and this is also, I'm happy to see all of you here. I get a few disclaimers out of the way. I am not the European Commission. I just work for one of their many projects. And the other thing is, when I say open source, for me it's 100% synonymous with free software. Just, you know, so that's out of the way. These are the things I'll be talking about. I can do this talk in two different ways. I can stand here and give you hundreds of examples of public service organizations doing open source. And then you'll all be very happy and you think, okay, we're done. We're not done. So 2 years ago, I looked at all these examples and I sorted them by success factor. And in this way, all these examples become actionable. And you can, if you work for a public sector, you can use this directly in your own organization. And if you don't work for a public sector, but you wish your public sector did more with open source, you can use this as a step to prepare the organization to change. On screen you see the list of things I'll be talking about. I will not do everything. If we have time and if you have questions, we can choose in the end 2 more topics that we can talk about. It depends if I talk too fast or if I talk too long about one of my examples, I'll run out of time, but normally it should take 30 minutes. But first I need to tell you a little bit about the OSOR. And my presentation is online. Everything that is blue is a hyperlink. And if you click on S, if you ever find my presentation, you will see all my notes. So that's basically the things that I'm saying now. But I cannot speak hyperlinks. But so many things are hyperlinks in my talk. So if you think, hey, I need to know exactly the open standards policy of the UK, which I'll mention like 20 times, it's in my talk. It's under the S, and you can find the hyperlink. So you can reuse it. But first, as I said, the OSOR. The Open Source Observatory of the European Commission started in 2006. Ideas have been circulating for already a few years at the Commission. They wanted to build a community of public sector people that were using open source or that were trying to figure out what to do with open source, because public money should be public code. People at the Commission realized this already at a very early stage, and that's where this project started. Now, after 12 years, 11 years, we have some 2,000 news items, we have over 100 case studies where we look in depth in how a public sector organization is using open source, and we have gathered some 4,000 software solutions that are built by public sector organizations and that are available for public sector organizations. And this is really the driving force of the OSOR. We're trying to get public sector to realize your money, the one that you put in ICT, should also be used by your neighbors, be it the municipality next door, or the province, or the country, or the commission, or anybody else. And OSOR did one more thing. The European Commission wanted its own license. It's called the European Union Public License. It's basically a fork of the GPL. It's compatible with the GPL 1.2 and 1.3. And the Commission thought about, the reason they started this license is because they needed to make sure that the GPL would work for European copyright. It's slightly different from here and in the US, slightly different from between Bulgaria and Germany, slightly different between Bulgaria, Germany, and the Netherlands. So they gathered all these lawyers to make sure the language in the license works for European copyright lawyers. And very importantly, the Commission wanted to make sure that this license works towards public sector making their software available to others. So it is very strong copyleft. and it has a long list of licenses that it is compatible with. That means you can use as a developer an EUPL program and combine it with a software library that has a completely different license, because the two will be compatible. And then you can choose. I either do it under a new license, or I do it as a EUPL, or I pick the license from the library. Actually, the Commission doesn't really care, as long as the end goal is your software needs to be out there and other public administrations should be using it. Anyway, enough about the OSOR. Let's just take the first step, right? Because that's what we're here for. How do we do open source in public administrations? Well, here we go. Step one. You must have somebody in your organization who is responsible. Is this about license cost? Yes, it's about license cost. But license costs are really just the tip of the iceberg. This is about scalability. This is about flexibility. This is about taking control as a public sector over your IT. You must be able to know what happens to your voting machines. I think this is a very black and white example. You must be able to know what happens in your data centers. You must be able to control who has access to your data, which is our citizens' data. You need to be autonomous as a government, because we cannot become Microsoft government. We cannot become Oracle government. So you need somebody to talk to your procurement guys in your organization, and you have to explain to them, guys, it is officially not allowed, not in Bulgaria, not in Germany, not in the Netherlands, not under any European procurement rule, to procure Oracle 10G. That's a proprietary brand. That means there's only one guy that can offer that solution. But you are allowed to procure Postgres, which is a direct competitor. Because even Oracle can offer a solution based on Postgres. You do not hinder competition that way. So you're not allowed to procure directly a proprietary brand. I'll just repeat it because it's important and many people don't realize, but it's fine to say I want Linux. It's also a brand, but everybody can offer it. So you don't hinder competition. You need your CEO or your decision maker or your city council member or your government chief infrastructure officer, IT officer, to create a good strategy. And you can reuse a strategy that is out there. You can look at Barcelona, you can look at the UK, you can look at France, and you can even look at Bulgaria. Bulgaria is, for us, one of the good examples out here, beginning to become a very good example. You need somebody to show that building an open source strategy is good for local firms. You create a healthy ICT sector that is not dependent on big American firms, that create local jobs, that create innovation that can go across the world. One example would be the Basque region, which has built a very healthy sector, which is now working for the German car industry in southern Germany. And it's so interesting that the trade group that does one of the biggest IT trade fairs out there in Germany, CeBIT, is working with the Basque region to buy, it has already bought, their trade fair, because they want the links to become stronger. So every time I take a step, the second slide will be a bunch of examples. Here they're ranked, of course, you can see that, you can read it, so I won't have to quote it, nationally to small. I'll just take one. Again, all the links are clickable. You can find directly the news item or the case study or another link that will prove to you why this is an example here. But the one that's interesting is the second line. You see all these groups of municipalities that work together. And this is done by, in Denmark, in Norwegia, in Norway, Belgium, Sweden, and it happens basically in every European member state, where you'll have 5 or 6 or 10 or 20, or in the case of Denmark, 80% of all the municipalities that pool money and that together work to develop an open source solution that they can use, all of them. For example, the Belgian group, this has 75% of all the municipalities in the French-speaking part of Belgium. So if one town improves the tool, it's immediately available to almost all the other towns. You can see how smart this is. And I'll get back to the last example. Eurocontrol, it comes later. The second big step that we all must take as public sector organizations if we want open source to succeed is that we need a good open source, I will continue to make this mistake, good open standards policy. And in this room, I'm pretty sure everybody here knows open standards, but you also know that one open standard is not an open standard. It's like, you know, like George Orwell, some open standards are more open standards than other open standards. So you need to have the right definition. You have to be very careful in your selection process, because there are fake open standards. And you need to walk your talk. It makes no sense to have a very good open standards policy and then to ignore it and do something entirely different. Public services that do not use open standards are actually working against those that do. This is not me saying it, these are public administrations saying that they are really finding it troublesome that, for example, the Commission keeps sending documents and document requirements that are not an open standard, because in their IT systems, that doesn't really work. A list of examples ranked from, well, it's not really ranked. The most important one for people in this room maybe is the Tallinn e-government declaration. It was signed by all the member states a year ago. Has a very strong reference to open source, has a very strong reference to open standards, and you can use it to your local sector saying, hey, our country said we were going to do this, maybe we should start preparing to do this here too. If you want a list, a good list of open standards, use the Swedish list. It's like, it has 46 open standards on it, and they've done all their homework. They used the Dutch list that was out there already for a few years. The Dutch list has 83 standards. And then they said, okay, well, some of these are only for the Netherlands, so they threw those out. And then they asked 2 researchers to look at the rest and say, is this really an open standard? Can it be implemented in open source? This is I say this on purpose, this is the European Commission's definition. An open standard is only an open standard if you can implement it in open source software. And that means that it should not contain, for example, a binary blob that is secret, because it makes it very hard for open source people to work against. It also means, according to Sweden, that the process to maintain the standard should be open. You, I, me, anybody should be able to join in a discussion on how to continue this open standard. So they wiggle down this list from 80 to 43. And the Commission says this Swedish list is a really good list, so you can start with that. And if you want more context, you have the last 3 links that build, these are the European mechanisms that build how the Commission is thinking about sharing and reuse. And this is slowly percolating into the member state, because everybody is now knowing, okay, we need to go that way, but how do we put this into our legislation? And these are the things that help. I'm never entirely done with open standards. Practically, if you look, for example, at the UK, so they have a good, they do a lot of good things, and one of the things they say is, okay, we have all these open standards, but we're going to put everything we publish on the web. And when you do that, please use, of course, the accepted standards that the open source community uses, HTML5, CSS3, and there's a whole bunch of others. And this talk, for example, is built using those tools. I just put this here because I want to also show or tell public administration that if you do this, try to use Mozilla Firefox. If you turn your applications into web apps, build it against Firefox and make sure it works on all the platforms. There's 2 reasons. A, it gives you some leverage over your software suppliers who are maybe building this app, and you can tell them, I want it to run in Firefox, and they say, but we only program against Chrome or against IE. Yeah, sorry, I want it against Firefox, and it has to run the same way on all these 3 platforms, Linux, Microsoft, Windows, and Apple. So you have some room all of a sudden to negotiate and say, otherwise I'll take it to your competitor, because they can do it. And the other reason is Mozilla is really a good member of the open source community. They make it possible for projects to come to conferences. They sponsor people to do things in the open source space. Very important step. You need to help the organization change. There's many public sector organizations that do open source that forget this step. And then at some point in time, you will run into friction. Somebody in your organization will not like what you're doing. And we all work with IT. We know it's hard to turn to a new tool. It's especially hard, apparently, to do this with open source. And if there is ever a project that fails, very often when we start looking, it's because they forgot to do this well. They started doing it, but they didn't really organize it, or they ran out of steam too fast. So how do you do this? Uh-oh. Okay, so officially this was supposed to show a map of the European Union, and then you would have red dots where the projects failed, and green dots where the projects worked. And the internet worked 10 minutes ago, but now it doesn't, so sorry about that. Anyway, you need to take small steps. You do pilot programs. I'll go back to the previous, because it's a pity to look at the site, it doesn't work. You need to communicate. You need to talk to your staff and explain why you're doing this. You do newsletters, you do workshops, you do hackathons, you do open gatherings, you get the SMEs from your local town to get involved. You need to get the key people in your organization involved and get them on board. One of the examples I would have shown on the map would be the city of Nantes in France that actually worked with the head of finance. So he thought it was financially very interesting to go to LibreOffice, but he also started using it. And he convinced his colleagues that these spreadsheets are like really all the same. You need to work with your HR guy. If he sees that it's workable, then he can talk to the people that come to HR saying, yeah, I have to work with this new tool, it's impossible, I want to go somewhere else. He said, look, we are all using it, it's not that hard. Can you use an Android phone? Can you use an iPhone? Then you can also switch to a new application. It's really not that hard. One example that would be on this European map that we all know about because it's world famous would be the city of Munich in the south of Germany that had a very successful switch to open source. And then there were elections. And then the mayor came in and the new mayor said, yeah, but I am used to this other system. I would like to go back to this other system. And that's what we hear. And then you start talking to the IT department and you start talking to the decision makers. What you need to realize that Munich has 23 IT departments in one town. And the drive was already 12 years ago, we need to centralize because this can be done smarter. And the mayor at the time said, let's centralize on Linux. And that worked successfully for the departments that switched because those people do not complain at all about their IT. But it didn't do very well with the departments that didn't want to lose their kingdoms. So they had a little war inside the city with all these people in departments that did not want to move because they would lose political influence. And that gave the new mayor a door or a switch, a lever to say we are going to continue this centralization, but we're not going to do this battle with the operating system. We'll just do what the other guys are also using. It'll make it easier because they cannot use it as an argument. Now, the latest that I pick up is that they are not able to actually switch. It will be far too expensive. So they'll switch parts and bits and pieces because, for example, on the desktop there's lots of friction with users because they did a lot of change management, but there's always things to fix. So there will be changes, but in the infrastructure part, you will continue to see Linux running. What I can do, however, is show you this for change management. Sorry, skipping ahead. I was too fast in my previous example. I'm now going to the next step. You have to engage the communities. That's the last step. And public administrations actually don't know how to work with open source. And this is the example. Eurocontrol, all the flights over Europe are controlled using open source software running on Linux servers. It makes me feel very safe, actually. But this, on the right, you see Eurocontrol. This is how they see themselves. It's almost military organized, very precise, very organized. And they are very, they don't want outsiders to know exactly what they're doing because it's mission critical stuff. And on the other side, that's how they see the open source movement. It's a little bit unorganized. It's certainly this wave that can overrun them. And it's very difficult to figure out a way how to interact. Because the open source people, they only do what they want to do, right? They don't do what we are telling them to do. So how do we do this? I'll let you laugh over the picture and go back to the slide. There, engage the communities. So how do you do this? It's really not that hard. You require in-house skills. You just hire open source people. Hire people that come to the OpenFest conference. You optimize your procurement so that small companies from the region, small companies from your town actually stand a chance so that they can, you know, offer successful solutions. And in your procurement you say, I would like to have the code, all the code that you write, and I would like to have the right to study the code, to modify the code, and to redistribute the code, because I want it to be used by me, but maybe also my neighbor, the town next door, or the province next door. You need to, in your organization, realize that open source licenses are far easier to work with than proprietary licenses. You need to look at an open source license just once, and then you say, okay, the GPL is nice, the AGPL is fine, EUPL is fine because it works with European copyright, and then, you know, you make this list. And these licenses don't really change over time. Maybe once every 10 years there's a new version, but and the updates is easy to understand. And it will allow you as a public sector to move forward with your software. If you do this with proprietary software, the license changes every time there's a new version. The license changes every time you do something with your hardware. The license changes every time you, whatever. And then you have to go back to your legal department, and legal department has to study the license, and by the time they're done with their work, there's a new version. So open source licenses are really easy to work with. So you make it possible for the staff in your public sector organization to work with open source. You say you can just write whatever you want and publish it wherever you like using one of these licenses. You give them time to work on open source. These are all the examples on the screen. Public administrations that had figured out a way how to make this possible. I'll mention Helsinki. The city council there told the IT department, we want you to do more open source. And the CEO said, yeah, it's really, you know, we don't do that. Nothing in our culture here has any of this. But so eventually he hired a bunch of open source guys, and slowly the organization changed. And now they have a Helsinki Loves IT. There's a whole project where they hire open source skills, and the open source skills people help drive the change in the organization. Same at the European Commission, they have a critical mass of Drupal developers walking around. And it's really changing everything they touch, because they come with GitHub, they come with open source laptops, they come with open source development tools, all the code they write, they want it to be published out there. They go to conferences, they talk. And it's helping the Commission mindset to see how worthwhile this is. Nance already mentioned, the GDS, the Government Digital Service in the UK, you can actually, I think it was similar to Google, 1 day per week you can work on a project that you like. Barcelona and Amsterdam are actively organizing hackathons and open days where they meet with NGOs and SMEs from their towns. Anyway, so the list of examples is endless. And at this point I need to know how much time I still have. You know that.
15 minutes.
I have?
Close to 15 minutes.
Close to 15 minutes, exactly what I had hoped. So I can do, either you can ask me a whole bunch of questions, or I can talk about, for example, I can give you a list of example policies, because you might think that's interesting. I don't think I need to talk about the expected benefits, not in this conference, right? That you all work with open source, that's a debate, that's tired. Or I can talk about what in my view is missing still from open source. So whatever you like, but basically my 4-step program is now done. These are just the things that I happen to know a lot about, so if you want more, I can talk more.
Thank you very much for that so far. So what do you guys prefer? Do you have any questions so far, or keep on what's missing? Any preferences?
I have
Yeah.
a question.
Just a second. It's first.
Okay. I have a question about Article 11 and 13 and their relation to open source.
I heard the question, I can repeat it. You're talking about the Copyright Directive,
Yes.
Article 13, yes. Okay, for the people that didn't see this, we need a wire
Now should be
to
fine.
make the microphone switch on.
Okay.
So, what should be the answer? I cannot say don't worry about it, because I think we should be vigilant. We should remain worried about things like this, because the Copyright Directive wasn't written by people that had an open source mindset. And they kind of, it's really hard for people that don't work in software to know what software is. This mistake happens in all the legislations. And in the Copyright Directive, this is an accident. It's a side effect, which is an IT term. It's being fixed, but we need to make sure it's fixed the right way. From what I understand is that they're going to make an exception for open source, so that it will not do the damaging side effects that they unintentionally added by writing it this way. But I can only say we can only sit back once we have that fixed, because this always happens. And then it will not be only the Copyright Directive, there will be another directive. There will be a new one. One that is interesting to look at is the Public Sector Information Directive, the PSI Directive. That's how it's known in English. Also, most people in the Commission talk about the PSI Directive. And this is written specifically to open government data. Lists of accidents, lists of museums, lists of artworks, any list that the government makes that can be anonymized and made available to companies and citizens to do interesting things with the open data movement. That's the PSI Directive. And the PSI Directive, when it starts, these are not part of the directive, it's not part of the legislation, but when it starts it says we do not talk about computer programs. That's not what we mean. But it doesn't really say what they think a computer program is. And everybody thinks a computer program is something else, right? Because we are talking software source code is not a computer program. It's only one part of making a computer program. So maybe software source code should be in the PSI Directive, because maybe we should say software that is written for a public government should be given back to the citizens. And this is how France reads its laws, and this is how France reads the PSI Directive. And I'll give you a funny example, if I may. There was a French school in the south of France, and at the end of the exam they have to say where they want to go next. They go to university, they want to become a dentist, they want to go and become a computer engineer, and so they need to take a list and they say I want to go to Bordeaux to do dentistry, or I want to go to, name me another town, Marseille to do computer science. And then after a few weeks the results come back and they go somewhere completely different. They don't go to the university where they wanted to go. And so they started asking, how come? And the ministry said, yeah, computer. And the students said, yeah, it's not good enough. Can you explain me how the computer decided that? And the minister who got this question said, yeah, that's complex, that's a computer. And the students said, yeah, it's not good enough. I really want to know how the computer decided it. Yeah, but that's IBM machines and faxes and PDP-11s, and I don't know, it's, complex. And the students kept their foot on the floor, and they managed to get the right people in the parliament, and the parliament started asking sharp questions, and the minister said, oh, dang it. And he eventually relented, so he kept trying to push the students back to their classrooms, but the students won. And the government published the source code to the algorithm that decided why they didn't go to Bordeaux. And then they found a bug, and of course they fixed it. That's how it goes, right? And the same thing happened with the French text code. There was a guy who worked for the Open Data Lab of France, and it was Friday afternoon, and we couldn't go home yet, so he said, you know what, I'll see if I can play with the text code, because his colleague upstairs, who wrote the text code, said, yeah, but that's a secret. So he started asking the right questions. But this took a whole long time, but now the French text code is also open source. And the text ministry is actually organizing data hackathons with open source developers to try and make this user-friendly, to make it more efficient, to make it better. And Thomas Piketty is now able to use the French text code to model in his own home if the French text system is actually a good system. And so France is one of the biggest countries in the EU realizing this is how we should have read the PSI Directive. And other countries should maybe do the same. So that was a tip for you guys to go home with. But that was far too long an answer to your question. Sorry. Anybody else?
Okay, I have a question. So it's a little bit more general, but how do you start with actually changing the mindset of people more going into the open source? Now you mentioned that some cases, you know, or in some countries, they're doing hackathons, which is one of the approaches to start, you know, go more into open source. So OpenFest is, you know, one example of that, but what else there is? How you push people to start thinking that direction?
So OpenFest is really important. And you guys have been around since, what was the first one? 2003, I think. This shows people in the government that there is a segment of society, there is a segment of the IT industry that is doing this as a service. Because one of the first doubts that public sector has, where do I get support? Because they don't basically want to be responsible. How to start? You have to start small. That's really the lesson that we discover. You do small pilots. Get somebody in the city council to say, can we at least run a pilot with hiring one open source developer for 1 year in our organization to do things, just to show us what it is. And then you'll see that this open source guy is able to overhaul some of the processes by saying, oh yeah, but that's easy, you can just use this framework, and here's your ID solution, and it's done, and it costs you nothing. And then people will start going, wait a minute, it was running in a week, and it cost me nothing, maybe we should do more of this. This is, for example, in my previous version of this talk, I would give you a top 3 of implementations across Europe. And the biggest one would be, for years, the French Gendarmerie, 72,000 desktops that all run Ubuntu, and the entire stuff. You know how that project started? There was an Excel sheet that wasn't working the way it should, because, you know, that's Excel. And the guy who had to fix that took it home and had LibreOffice, because then at least he could see in the source code where the calculation went out. And he was tweaking it, and he brought the LibreOffice laptop to his work, where a Microsoft sales guy happened to see it while walking by. And he went to the general saying, hey, one of your guys is using LibreOffice, that shouldn't be allowed because you have a Microsoft license. And the general was a smarter guy than the salesperson. He brought both the salesperson and the IT developer in and said, explain me what's going on. And the guy said, well, here is the spreadsheet. I fixed it because I have the source code. What's this? Yeah, it costs nothing. Oh, it costs nothing and it does it better? Maybe we should start rolling this out in the entire operation. That's how that started. Sorry. Again, I digress.
Thank you for that. Okay, do we have any more questions? We have enough time for asking, so don't be shy.
I can give more examples.
Yeah.
It's not really a question. As far as I remember, we had a law that we made about open source software. We should publish public procurement projects as an open source, but I'm not sure how it's going in Bulgaria right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
How could I forget? I did mention Bulgaria was one of our best examples, right? I mean, I heard myself say that, but I didn't expand on this example. So indeed, smart people at this conference managed to get inserted into Bulgaria's law this clause that says IT development for the public sector from day one should go open source. This repository is now working. A year ago it wasn't working, and I think now there are 3 or 4 projects on it. They're not the world's biggest projects, but this is a start, right? And as an example for other member states, this is really, really good, because you change the way the public sector is supposed to think about it. And in the Commission, people think this is really inspiring, and they wish they would do something similar. This hasn't percolated to municipalities yet. I don't see any programs from cities, from Plovdiv yet on this repository. But eventually, yes. But in the Commission, for example, the policy is, as soon as we do something in IT where we have an idea that others might use it, other public administrations might use it, we must do it as open source. So then it goes on to, either it goes on to JoinUp, the repository where OSOR is also part of, or it goes on to GitLab or GitHub. It doesn't really matter.
Thank you. Any more questions? All right, here we have one.
In fact, I can state that this clause in our law is dead. but it's other question. My son only had a presentation at school, and his teacher said, "But why are you using LibreOffice? You have the best Microsoft Office, but why? All education system here is centralized around Microsoft products. How we should fight this?"
How would you like me to answer it?
Advice.
That is basically what this talk was about, so I maybe should start again. But this is really hard to do. So when we look at open source in public sector, it's really not a problem. Any public sector organization is already using open source, just as in companies, right? It's 90% of companies already use open source. Some aren't even aware of it. And the same is true for the public sector. They're all using open source. But the desktop is really difficult because it interacts with how users are used to work. And if I give you a new machine and it does entirely different things, even though you're supposed to do the same work, you're like, why is that logical? Just leave me be. You know, I used to click here and I have to click there. Why is that? So that's why this whole change management is really key. If you don't explain it to people, it will fail. But you need to start small. That's all I can say. Start with one project, with one department, with one floor, maybe with 4 laptops. This is what you see in many countries. You can go like Barcelona, where they do everything, because they have the whole chain of command set up. The city council says this is where we want to go. They hire a CEO that can then tell the organization we're going to change. And every time there is a problem, they can go to the CEO, and the CEO says, this is where we're going. It's also my bonus if we're not going that way. You need, like in the Ministry of Finance in Finland, you need a guy to explain it to everybody. They did the financial math. They said we can go to Lotus Notes, we can go to Microsoft Office, or we can go to LibreOffice. And they went to LibreOffice. And there they discovered the IT department who was trying to pilot this. They realized that the license flexibility allowed them to do things they couldn't dream about with any of the other tools. So by the time the pilot had almost successfully completed, it was already installed on all the desktops. That would not even be possible with proprietary software because you have to go to this license scheme.
All right. Do we have any more questions? No?
I'll give you another example on how this license stuff can help bring change. You'll have a government, you have a parliament that tells the government, we need you to do something. Education needs to do more with computers. This happened, for example, in the Netherlands. And okay, so the Ministry of Education says, okay, here, IT department, we need to do something at schools. And we have 60,000 schools in the Netherlands. Sorry, I come from the Netherlands, that's why I know this example. And then they said that's 60,000 Oracle licenses and 60,000 WebSphere licenses. The cost of that is more money than we have in the Ministry of ICT, in the Ministry of Education. That's not possible. And then both Oracle and IBM said, well, yeah, well, then you can't do it, right? Either you pay or not. And for the ministry, that was the moment to switch to open source alternatives. And at first, the guys were really nervous because they had heard of Linux, and they have heard of PostgreSQL, and they had heard of, you know, all the other tools out there, Apache, but they had never really touched them. And then they started doing a small pilot, and they go, hey, that's exactly like the stuff I used to use at university. And they got enthusiastic, and now it is the big driver for change. The whole data center in the Netherlands is, for the governments, completely open source. And they are so happy with it because A, it works all the time, it's totally cheap, it's cheaper than the cloud competitors out there. And they have clients, government clients, that call them and say, for example, this was the National Archives, they called them 2 years ago, hey, we hear you have a new storage solution that is really handy, we would like to use that. That's fine, said the guy. How many gigabytes are we talking about? Nah, we're not really talking about gigabytes, it's the National Archives, several Godzilla bytes of data. And then the Dutch data center was, I'm happy that I'm using open source because I don't have to pay the licenses anymore. To scale up, I can go from 1 to 1 million boxes, and it doesn't matter. And this is what you'll see in all the financial centers in governments. All the tax people across Europe are running on open source. That's DG Taxud, that's the Hungarian Minister of Finance, that's the British HMRC, that's the Irish, probably in Bulgaria too. I just haven't managed to call them.
Okay, anybody with more questions? All right, so I believe that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your attention.